Hello and welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast here on the Everything Electric channel. Marvelous. Just before we start, can we, it's only me here, there's no one else, can I ask you in the most polite and non-intrusive way possible to, when you get the chance, if you feel in the mood, to give us a little review on your podcast app. Via your podcast app or Apple Podcasts or whatever way you use, you take in this material that we produce. I'm not doing a very focused introduction. I'm trying to focus a little bit more closely. So what I was hoping you would do is give us a little review. We've had some amazing, really positive reviews, and it does make a difference. It kind of jolts you up the list of podcasts, because I don't know if you've noticed, but there's quite a few of them around. And this podcast has been going a long time, and it's had very steady sort of low growth, but we've seen a little bit of a whoop, recently, and that is partly because people have been giving us wonderful 5-star reviews on their podcast download applications or whatever they use. And also, if you want to give us a lovely review on YouTube, that's slightly different, but if you want to say something nice, but also a comment of any sort for the podcast on YouTube, what's been noticeable is the number of views that we get, or listens, I don't know what you call it, downloads. Thank you. Your downloads we get on audio, the audio only version has increased at a kind of gentle level, but the number of views we get on YouTube has gone like that on the Everything Electric show, and which is growing very fast. So our subscribers are going up. So do subscribe. That's what we always say. But also, if you want to give us a review and tell us what you like and don't like, maybe it's the old bloke that waffles at the beginning. Hate him, but the other thing's really good. So we've got a wonderful guest today, Colin Walker from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Now, Colin appeared on a panel at Fully Charged Live, I believe in Farnborough this year, or maybe, I think it was Farnborough, or was it Harrogate? No, I wasn't on the panel. So for once, it's not my memory failing. I think Jack Scarlett was running the panel, and he was just brilliant. And there's quite a few people that we meet when they do the panels that we want to have on the podcast, and vice versa. You know, people who do podcasts, we think, God, they've got to be on a panel because they're just so clever. And Colin is very clever. And he's had a fascinating history of how he got to what he's doing now. And this is really interesting, sort of wide take, but mainly kind of focused on the UK, but it has total relevance around the world about the shift to less damaging methods of moving. So the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit covers every aspect of kind of human activity, you know, as well as transport. But he's very focused on transport and cycling and safe cities, cities that maybe aren't as dominated by the motor vehicle as they currently are, and the arguments and debates and difficulties and challenges of that. So that it's a really interesting podcast. I'm sure you'll really enjoy it. And Colin is a dude. And just to explain, at the beginning, I was a bit worried and jittery because we've recorded this podcast twice. And the first time we recorded it last week, I had a power cut at our house. Well, our house, for regular viewers will maybe know this, our house has batteries and solar and a system whereby when there's a power cut, we don't even know about it in the house. I'm just underlining that, in the house. But we do know about it if we're in my studio, which is outside the house, which is where I am now. It doesn't benefit from this extraordinarily clever bit of technology. So we had a power cut of about 20 seconds. It was really short, but it just killed everything, killed all the routers, killed all the lights in here. It broke the podcast. And when I finally got it all working again and got back in touch with Colin, neither of us had the files. I don't know what happened. The system, we use this thing called Zencaster. It's been incredibly reliable. And I just haven't even worried about it. I haven't even thought about it. It just works really, really well. Unless you have a power cut at 55 minutes, 29 seconds, which is when we had one. And what happened? We cannot find the files. So thankfully, we've recorded the episode again. We did a rehearsal. So we did manage to do it, and it's all marvelous. And Colin is a very patient and kind guest as well. So that's it. Let's dive into the podcast. So please welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast, Colin Walker from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. what people will never know is how brilliant we were last week. We were just, but yeah, absolutely. You were on fire. You were absolutely hammering it. But can we go back? So let's just go back to the steps you've taken to get where you are now, because it is it's quite an unusual journey. I think it's fair to say.
Well, it made
to be doing what you're doing now. Yes, yeah,
yeah. Well, I spent 15, 16 years of my life doing campaigns and advocacy in the charity sector. So I worked for people like Save the Children and Warchild and Plan. But my job before this was British Cycling. So I was kind of like the London regional lead for the governing body of cycling.
Right.
My personal passion, I'm always out on a bike. And yeah, from there, I got this opportunity to work at the fairly long-winded Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, or ECIU, to head up their new transport program. And I imagine an awful lot of people have no idea who we are, but we're basically analysts who exist to ensure that all the debates surrounding the net zero transition are informed by the facts. We've done a lot of work since we were set up in 2014 on energy and renewables, insulation, etc. Basically, to put it politely, it's to ensure that the non-factually based narratives surrounding the net zero transition are challenged, and that all the decision makers who are reading kind of the press are actually seeing the facts. And I think you'll probably understand better than most that we felt that there was a lot of these non-factually based narratives surrounding the transition to EVs. So we focus on that, but it's quite similar in all the debates that go on about LTNs and ULEZ zones and low traffic neighborhoods. Conspiracy theories around 15-minute neighborhoods, that kind of thing. So
yes,
let's try to keep the record straight.
No, it is. I mean, it is such an extraordinary battle that, yes, you're right. I've been involved in for years now, as it starts to unravel. But as you start to kind of hear these things, and what's always alarmed me about it is, I'll hear a report on a radio news program or read something in a newspaper and go, well, that's just factually incorrect. I mean, it's nothing to do with opinion because I know the topic. But then I hear a report about the health industry or airlines. I don't know how accurate. And then you go, I wonder how close that is to anything resembling the truth, which does make you slightly anxious.
It's a bit scary. Yeah. I mean, just conversations with friends, it's quite remarkable how some of the things, because we work on it all the time and we know they are ridiculous, it's a little alarming to the extent to which they set little, any conversation about electric vehicles with my friends, the speed of which they bring forward notions that, then they always run out of charge, or what about neighbor for cobalt in the DRC? And you're like, wow, this stuff really is getting through. So it's an uphill battle. I think if I'm trying to kind of like find some crumbs of comfort and optimism, I think the increasing ludicrousness of some of the narratives that suggest a degree of desperation, collapsing car parks,
was a perfect example.
Bridges that are designed to hold 40-ton HGVs suddenly collapsing under the weight of 2-ton Teslas. I think even a lot of people who aren't particularly versed in the battle we're facing, I think they even look at it and go, well, that seems a bit weird. So that's encouraging, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, it is that, I think this is one thing we discussed before, but is the kind of psychology of it, because which I've witnessed quite a lot recently, is that you live you're just a normal person. You don't have extremist views, and you've got an old petrol car, an old diesel car, and then you hear from these know-all show-offs like me, you should be driving an electric car, all that stuff, and so you want to have reasons to not do that, and because you don't want to change. I mean, it's expensive. How can you? I can't afford a new electric car. They're ridiculously expensive, which they are.
Completely. But I think we're in a really exciting period of the EV transition, because a lot of these vehicles are now beginning to appear, good quality, quite young EVs are beginning to appear on the secondhand market. Yeah. Having a little dig around last week on Auto Trader, and I found probably 16,000 miles on the clock, 4-year-old Nissan Leaf. Right. Or 13,000. £13,000 is not an inconsiderable amount of money, but it's when people talk about the barrier being the cost of a new EV being 40 grand plus, that really brings EVs into the reach of a lot more households. Yeah. That feels like the tipping point. There's so many conversations about the cost of new EVs and stuff, but to most people, that's kind of irrelevant, because what's it? 2% of car sales in the UK are secondhand?
Secondhand, yeah. Who bought?
That's where the change happens.
Yeah. I always said I did before I got into any of this. So in the majority of my adult life, I didn't even know people who bought new cars. I knew that there were new people that bought them. I never met them. They weren't in my social group. 90% of my mates didn't have a car anyway because you couldn't afford one. And the ones that did bought like fifth hand, not second hand was posh. Those are the flash people with money.
£200 convertible Peugeot 205.
Yeah.
That pretty much just about kept going. I certainly don't move in the right circle of friends to be surrounded by people who are buying all their cars new. But that's the tipping point. And obviously company cars and very generous business in kind schemes and the salary sacrifice schemes that are popping up all over the shop. They seem like quite good mechanisms to drive forward new EV uptake. And the quicker they're taken up, the quicker they'll appear in the second-hand market, and more people can start benefiting from the savings that come from EV ownership.
But then, I think the important thing that we should, that I know that you're very keen on because of your background in cycling is, that bigger argument in a way about our relationship with cars. I think and that's what is quite awkward, I suppose, in a way, for the fully charged show as an institution to be saying, have you thought about not buying a car anyway? That's in a way that, there is no solution. We live in cities, particularly in this country and in Europe, we live in cities that basically were developed 1,000 to 500 to 1,000 years ago, where you didn't have to park your carriage outside your house to feed your horse. So we've crammed cars into environments that they were not designed for, and they've completely messed up those streets.
I think there's a messaging thing here, also about aspiration. I don't think we should be I think it wouldn't work if we tried to tell everyone they need to get rid of their cars.
No.
Because there was a really interesting bit of polling from Ipsos Mori recently, where they found that 71% of the people they spoke to supported efforts to get people out of their cars and do more active travel.
Right.
But exactly the same percentage of people also said that they wanted to keep their cars because they depend on them to some extent. So I don't think a lot of efforts to improve active travel are about trying to get people to give up their cars.
No.
They're misinterpreted, they're misrepresented as such. But I do think it's about kind of making active travel seem like the most attractive means of doing a high portion of your journeys. Like it's at something like 67, close to 70% of journeys between 1 and 5 miles are done in a car.
Yeah.
It seems like the low hanging fruit that we really, if we have decent infrastructure, it would probably go, well, the quickest way to get from A to B is, B is 3 miles away. Really, a bike should be the quickest and most convenient way of getting there. But at the moment, a lot of people feel it isn't, which is kind of understandable to some extent. Cycling in Britain is not like cycling in the Netherlands. Sometimes people really do feel like they're taking their life in their own hands.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, the way to present it. And for more and more people, I think London's quite good at this compared to most other cities. And you get car ownership
in the UK,
low because often the idea of traveling across London by car is just
crazy.
Crazy. It is by far and away the slowest way of getting from A to B. It still amazes me how many people do that.
Yes.
London, I think because of the investments in cycling infrastructure, it's becoming cycling is a much more attractive alternative now than it might be in other places.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And it is interesting to see the battles that are going on in various European cities. So Paris is an extraordinary example of that first sort of leap where, sort of basically taking back the streets for human beings. But I've just read a report from Berlin where I was, I don't know 5 years ago, and they've done amazing sort of stuff about cycling and cycling stuff. And they've now had a new government that's reacted entirely the other way and wants to grab back the freedom for people to drive their cars in Berlin. And now there's this massive demonstration in Berlin of 10,000 cyclists who just clogged up the city.
Wow.
So this is there is a sort of micro civil war almost of this sort of stuff.
Yes.
It is extraordinary.
It's almost slightly depressing, but also reassuring to hear that it's not just the UK where cycling feels like it's a bit of a Cold War issue. Weirdly, notions of individual freedom do seem to quite become quite wrapped up in any effort to roll out things designed to encourage and enable people to cycle more. It does seem to be a bit ideological. I guess it's, you look at the candidates who stood in the last local elections in London, a lot of the kind of right of centre candidates often more likely to stand on anti-LTN, anti-cycling kind of platforms than those on the other side. But what's quite interesting is when they analysed, I think they looked at 5 wards in Ealing where they had introduced low traffic neighbourhoods.
Right.
The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats had adopted kind of quite anti-LTN, and their vote share all dropped.
Right.
So it comes to that point I think we spoke about last time, which is this noisy minority versus a silent majority.
Yeah.
You would think, looking at the way it's covered in the press and on social media, that actually levels of hostility towards these initiatives these views are held by the majority, but they're not at all. And I think it's a questionable political strategy to try and be overtly anti things like LTN, because it doesn't necessarily guarantee you success. Why this kind of loud vocal minority do seem to have such a disproportionate effect on decision making on these things, I don't know why that is, but it's quite interesting when you do look at places like France, where they, like we did, saw a surge of interest in cycling as a result of the COVID pandemic. And whilst we took a lot of the temporary cycle lanes out, they kept them. And Paris is unrecognizable from 5 years ago when it comes to cycling.
Yeah.
But then, as we know, they've also got a bit of a different relationship with other forms of micromobility, like scooters, where 90% of the residents of Paris voted to get rid of the rental scheme.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it's quite complicated.
It is complicated. But I mean, the thing that I was actually talking to a friend the other day, man, I know we discussed this, and since we discussed this last time about pedal assist bikes and that, and the change that's had. But he is a kind of cycling purist, so he refuses to ride one. But he now admits that because his wife, who never cycled with him, has got a pedal assist bike, they actually go all over the country on their bikes very happily, and she's got a pedal assist one. Yeah, effectively an electric bike, and so that it's actually, as he said, it's almost rekindled my marriage. So he's taken it all back. He still won't ride one, but he admits they're a really good idea.
Well, I had never thought that it's encouraging electric bike uptake would have such additional benefits, but yay. I like to think that the notion that electric bikes are somehow cheating is kind of like fading away a little bit.
I think so, yeah.
I think a lot of people who often have that view have never tried one. They're absolutely credible. But that's the thing I like. I'm less interested in electric bikes on how people who are already active cyclists engage with it. It's much more how do electric bikes enable people who've never cycled or are not cycling or often who are older and think that cycling is no longer for them. Yeah. There's this lovely, I have to dig it out somewhere. There's actually a lovely video of a man who must have been in his mid-80s, was quite the cyclist back in his day, but obviously getting older and couldn't really ride his road bike anymore. So his son bought him an electric road bike, and you watch him get back on it and back doing something that used to be his life that he thought was past him. And it probably brought a tear to my eye. But it's the way it makes cycling accessible and available to more people. Now, the obvious barrier to that is electric bikes are more expensive, and prices are going up recently. So there are things like the Bike to Work scheme that can help enable people access to them. But I can understand why some people would say that price is a bit of a barrier. But there are also plenty of stories of people in London who do barely use their cars, who have got rid of their cars to replace it with an electric cargo bike or something. So it can work. Yeah.
Because that went up with a couple of things because that we did discuss that how I'm on the fence. I don't know if there is a fence, but I'm on the fence when it comes to scooters, because of like urban rentable short journey scooters. Because when I've used them, I've not used them in the UK, but I've used them bizarrely in Paris and Brisbane. I'm trying to remember where else. And Sydney. Did I use them in Sydney? I don't remember. No, Brisbane definitely. And it was great for me as a visitor to those cities to just get on to have an app that goes beep and the thing works. You get on the scooter, go to the place. And in Brisbane, they come with a helmet that clips on, and it won't work till you unclip it, and then you put the helmet on, and then, which I felt safer having the helmet on, even though it was incredibly hot. And the helmets are hot because they've been out in the sun. So you put this really hot helmet on. That was a slight downside. Yeah. But That seemed really good, except there was no infrastructure for it. So I was riding on, and you have to ride on the pavement in Brisbane. There's different rules, isn't there, in different cities?
Yeah.
And that just felt wrong. When I was cycling along, I was zooming along, if there was no pedestrians, then so what? But when there were pedestrians, I just went, that's really dangerous. This is really bad. This isn't going to work.
Yeah, it's particularly confusing in the UK because their legal status is so... Yeah. I mean, I was looking into this a bit more, and they are officially they're actually classified as motor vehicles under the road.
Right, which they should be, I think. They've got...
Therefore, to drive them, you require a license, insurance, and tax. But no one offers insurance on them. So you can never use them legally on the road.
Right.
And because they're powered vehicles, they're not allowed to be on the pavement either. But you are legally allowed to buy them. You're just not really allowed to use them pretty much anywhere unless you're on private land with the landowner's permission.
Yeah.
So that makes it all really confused, I think. And I kind of sympathize with a lot of kind of scooter advocates because they're probably just waiting for clarity from the government about what their legal status is. And I think there was talk about bringing in regulation, but that's delayed until the end of this year, probably going into 2024. And yet, in the meantime, these vehicles will continue to be sold, but everyone will be using them illegally.
Yeah.
I think they can only be used rental schemes. That's fine because they're being used as trials for the government to kind of take the evidence by how they pan out and use that to inform the legislation they're going to introduce. I think just looking at it purely from a kind of like physical space on the road, an e-scooter is a much, much, much more efficient use of the limit you have in a city than a car. Doesn't produce pollution or particulates, which is great for all those kind of different things. I guess looking at it from and again, without trying to sound like a snobby cyclist, the only thing I remember saying a lot to local authorities when I worked at British Cycling and trying to get them to engage more to encourage cycling was one of the things we'd say was the huge physical and mental health benefits that come from cycling.
Yeah.
What I'm not clear on is the extent to which those benefits exist from scooters. I do think there's something about being out and about in the air, you are active to some extent. But it would be... I've seen them being used very irresponsibly, and they have... it's evident that a lot of these things get chipped because they're not supposed to go over 15 miles an hour, 15 and a half miles an hour. Very clearly, people have chipped them so they can go a lot quicker than that. But that same thing happens with electric bikes.
Yeah.
And I'm slightly... When you see one person, what I really dislike about the debate around cycling is people will see one person on a bike doing something bad, like going through a red light, and then therefore assume that all cyclists behave like that. I'm really reluctant to think just because I saw one person on a scooter doing a bad thing, but that means all scooter users are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really messy grey area, and I think the government really does need to kind of provide some kind of like legal certainty about what the legal status of scooters are, because no one knows.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. And also, I mean, I think the thing is, that all those sort of compromised, slightly awkward, is it this way, that way, it's a bit dangerous. When you mix a human body that moves along the ground on a bicycle or on a scooter with a 1.5 to 2 ton metal box, it's just a bad idea.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what legislation or laws or responsible use is there. That's all I want. So, and when you mix someone who's on a fast-moving, motorized, lightweight machine, which is a scooter or a bicycle, and people who are walking, basically. So, how do you design your city? If you were going to start from scratch, you'd have that's where you walk, that's where you cycle or use a scooter, that's where you drive a car or a truck. It would be simple. It's not that hard, but we've got to adapt a medieval streetscape to fit that.
Yeah. I mean, it is. And unfortunately, that's the thing. Sometimes, really, the solution to getting more people cycling is the provision of segregated, safe infrastructure. There's not really...
There's not really anything else.
Really. Yeah. And that requires investment.
Yeah. And in a way, legislation, because for 100 years, cars just took over. That's what's the biggest bit of the space between two buildings on a street? It's where cars go.
It is just
become the norm.
Spectacularly inefficient use of urban space, and it's in urban areas on the whole a very inefficient means of moving people around. I always laugh when often on social media people will show one of the bike lanes in London, and go, look, it's empty, no one's using it. You're like, I the kind of a voice from my like undergraduate geography degree many years ago reminded me of something that said that the most efficient forms of transportation are the ones that seem empty. That's why trains always appear empty.
Yeah.
They're actually moving people around incredibly efficiently. And was it, I think, I don't know how these stats just suddenly come back to my head, but I think the government found that the big bike lanes in London, the kind of the cycle highways along embankments and over Blackfriars, which carried 46% of the human traffic, but using only 30% of the space.
Right.
So it is more efficient.
Yeah.
But it does require taking space from motorists, and that will always result in a perception that they're under attack or they're being disadvantaged.
Yeah.
So if it encourages more people out of their cars and onto their bikes, it could actually also have a beneficial impact on traffic flows on roads. But it requires political willpower, and I'm not sure if that's there at the moment, but we've seen in places like the Netherlands, they were not always a cycling mecca in the 60s and 70s. It was a very car-dominated culture. They had this thing called the Kindermord, I think. It was really horrible. Lots of children were dying in road traffic accidents. Right. And they decided to do something about it. And they invested in cycle lanes, and they remained committed to that investment. And now pretty much everyone in Holland cycles, and they can wear bike helmets because they don't need to, because they're segregated and they feel safe. There were protests at the time. There's video footage of people getting out of their cars and trying to pull down the cycling infrastructure.
Wow.
The government stayed committed to it. And now I can imagine the vast majority of Dutch people, if you ask them, would you like to go back to the way things were then, would say no. So it can be done.
Yeah. And it does. I mean, it's when you experience it firsthand, you even like a completely a car-free side street. So, if you think of a sort of narrowish side street with terraced houses on either side, plenty of that in the UK, and you go into one in the Netherlands. Well, the one I saw was in Utrecht, where you cannot get a car down there. There's bollards in the way, and they've come up with so many solutions for. Well, I want to put my sofa in. I need to carry my sofa in my house. I need a delivery van. Well, when the delivery van comes to the end of the road. And there's people that live there with a huge trolley thing.
Really?
That you put the sofa on the trolley thing and you push it up the road. I mean, of course, it's flat.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking now of terrace streets I know which are really steep.
I'll work out how that might work in like Sheffield.
Yes, exactly. But, just for the sake of argument, but, there are solutions to all those problems. Oh, it's electrically powered, the trolley thing. So it's it's just a package removal, a pack like you'd use in a factory, but the street is so nice to walk along, and there's kids looking at, and there was an old lady sitting on her chair talking to some kids outside her house, and it was it was in the summer, and there's big flower, big flower things. What do you call them? Raised beds with flowers and trees, and you go, it's a totally different environment to a narrow street with cars parked on the curb either side, which is what we're used to.
Cities are meant to be for humans.
Yeah.
Right? Not necessarily dominated by the things that humans use to travel around. And again, it just comes back to that point. Typically, when you introduce a lot of these schemes, when Waltham Forest in London really kind of blazed a bit of a trail for introducing kind of low traffic neighbourhoods, cutting off cars for places like Walthamstow Village and introducing cycle lanes. When they do polling of the residents and say, would you like things to go back to the way they were? They say no, because it's nice. Right. And a lot of scaremongering that often goes, if you close this road off to cars, businesses will suffer. Yeah. No, businesses typically experience a 40% increase in footfall if the street that they're on is pedestrianised or limited to traffic.
Right.
It's very easy to assume that the worst is going to happen, despite the fact that all the evidence out there is that you will actually be your benefit.
Yeah.
And if only we could. There is an organisation called the Dutch Cycling Embassy, which is there to try to kind of spread the word about great stuff in the Netherlands. If we could just get more decision makers and more people
be aware of that,
and to see what that's like, people probably it's quite nice.
But I mean, it's odd because we're a channel that is absolutely started and is kind of focused on electric vehicles, and I like to sort of spread it to electric ground transport, so it's anything that we're interested in. But But my obsession now is increasingly becoming, how do we get cars out of cities? And I think one of the things, I think we mentioned this before, but one of the things that I think is so funny is all the early sort of automotive journalist analysis of electric vehicles or ideas about electric vehicles in the early days was that these are fine for an urban environment, but they really won't work out in the country. And experience shows it's 100% opposite that. An electric car makes a huge amount of sense if you live in a rural area, and no sense at all if you live in a dense urban area.
I mean, I imagine car ownership amongst the Dutch population is pretty high. And a lot of people have given up their cars to ride around on their bikes. They have bikes that they use to get around the city because it is the most pleasant and efficient means of doing so, and cars to probably leave the city and go on longer journeys. And that's probably what you need to be replicated across a lot of UK cities. It's not about people being told they can't have an EV, but just kind of probably it's in everybody's interest that people choose to adopt slightly less, what should we say, negatively impactful forms of transportation in an urban environment. And EVs are great for so many things, like particularly tackling climate change, for example, but they don't really do anything about congestion.
No.
At all. And congestion is a problem. I mean, I do believe they are much better for air quality than the vehicles they're replacing. I do think there are positives there because of regenerative braking means they don't produce particulate matter from brake pad wear to anywhere near the extent of a petrol equivalent. But yeah, you can see why I think a lot of people who are very much on the cycling side of things, pushing things, are a bit wary about EVs because they're like from the perspective of a cyclist and about trying to get more space allocated to cycling. A kind of a pure focus on EVs doesn't do anything for that agenda. So I think it's about encouraging people to replace enabling people to replace their petrol and diesel vehicles with more environmentally friendly electric vehicles, or simultaneously making cities much safer and more pleasant to use for alternative forms of transport.
Yeah. And I mean, what your remit covers things like public transport, I'm assuming, and because I mean,
transport's a big brief.
Yes,
I only started last August, and we'd never had a transport program, so we thought, let's do one step at a time.
Right.
And the way we looked at it, we sort of like, transport is the single largest source of greenhouse gases in the UK. And like a lot of sectors like power generation have come down dramatically and impressively, and it's just such a wonderful good news story. Transport's remained quite stubbornly the same level as it has been for a while. So obviously, decarbonisation in an awful lot of different transport sectors is happening to varying levels of success. But where we decided where we should focus most is where are the biggest narrative challenges that are holding back that transition to non-fossil fuels. And it was just electric vehicles. It was just, there's so much said about the minerals come from, because they produce more CO2 when they're being built, they're just as bad as the petrol cars. They're producing wrong over their lifetime. They produce 2/3 less. So it's about this constant churn of these narrative, non-factually based narratives, as I like to call them, that are coming out in the press and trying to counteract them. But I do think as we become more settled, we'll probably look to focus on other areas. I think active travel, challenging all the kind of things that are said about LTNs that actually aren't really borne out by the evidence. I think aviation is going to be a big one. I mean, there's been some great stuff on Fully Charged showing the developments that are taking place with like using hydrogen and battery electric technology to power planes, but for the big long haul flights. The solutions aren't jumping out as much as they are for other forms of transportation. And then you get into a really messy area, which is demand management. And no one wants to be told they can fly less, even though the vast majority of flights are taken by a small number of people. Perception that you're restricting people's freedom to go on holiday by plane should they so wish. That is a real problem. So I'm trying to hold that one off a little bit.
But also, I mean, that was it, because I was actually yesterday talking to a young man who's just started an engineering job at Rolls-Royce Aero Engines, not the car company. And he was going, I know you'll think it's awful because I work at, I'm working on jet engine. I go, well, for a start, my opinion is not of any importance, but also that, if you look at the global impact of air, even now of commercial air travel, passenger air travel, it's about 5%. If you look at the global impact of ground transport, it's massive. It's absolutely massive. And shipping, massive. But actually, and cruise ships,
the air quality.
And the air quality.
Air quality in Southampton, because the cruise ships that dock there is
shocking,
abysmal. You're right. But if you were looking at where can we have the biggest impact to decarbonize transport, you would look at land, you'd look at roads.
Ground transport, and it's the lowest hanging fruit. It's the one we can solve. That's I think, the critical thing.
But what's good about the EVs is that when we try to talk about them, we almost speak less about the environmental impact. It's because there's another driver. It's cost. Purely looking at it from the perspective of your wallet, there's really a strong argument for making that transition.
Yeah.
And it is advantageous that this new technology is also really good for reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And yeah, so I think I do believe on EVs, without sounding like kind of naive or overly optimistic. I do think we're on an inescapable trajectory.
Yeah.
I think, I write this down somewhere because the International Energy Agency did their big EV report.
Yes, they've done something recently, haven't they?
Yeah. Is it? So global EV sales exceeded 10 million in 2022. So I think there were only 5% of sales in 2022 and are now 14% of all new cars sold 2 years later. That's exponential growth.
Yeah.
And when you've got these Chinese companies appearing out of nowhere that no one's ever heard of, but will probably be the biggest car companies in the world in 10 years' time, beginning to produce smaller, more affordable, like that BYD Dolphin.
Yeah.
Those are the game-changing technologies. So I feel EVs are on a really positive, inescapable trajectory. So at some point, shipping, aviation are challenging, but as you say, they make up a much smaller percentage of global emissions and land.
But it's also things like, because I'm obsessed with all this, but I didn't know. So Volvo recently celebrated their 5,000th heavy truck on the roads in Europe. Because I thought, I've seen some and we've driven them and I've been in them and we've looked at them at exhibitions, and I didn't know there were any around. They just kind of, and there's all the hoo-ha about the Tesla Semi, and it's amazing, and the Nikola truck in America, and it's and that gets huge media attention. And meanwhile, there's a company like Volvo, who I've got, I think, a patchy record in their sort of output about electric vehicles. They've just been making electric trucks because there's demand for them, because the trucking industry wants them, because they are cheaper to run and they're cheaper to operate.
It's very Volvo.
That's why they're
kind of, you're like, oh, you made 5,000. Wow.
You've made 5,000. They're right. There's 5,000 on there. They're selling about 1,000 a week, and they're just launching their 46 ton. So colossal, what we would call articulated lorries, semi-truck. And the biggest, and that's there's 400 kilometers range in it, and it's huge.
It wasn't that long ago that everyone made the assumption that it would be hydrogen.
Yeah,
and the argument for hydrogen for road transport is just.
It's not. I mean, I'd be thrilled if it was economically viable and possible, and it happened. I'm not, that's the silly thing is I get people say, you hate hydrogen. I said, how can I hate hydrogen?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think as we both, I'm a long-term cyclist. If I'm cycling down a road and a diesel truck overtakes me, it's horrible because the smell is disgusting and it's gross. And if a hydrogen truck overtook me, I'd be happy as Larry. There'd be some water on the road. Might be a bit slippy, but it's so much better.
It's just
but it's not happening,
isn't it? So much energy renewable energy would have to be built to actually produce hydrogen e-fuels.
Yeah,
the numbers don't add up, and it'll be better to reserve production of those kind of fuels for the sectors that really need it. They don't really have any alternatives, like aviation. It's like we're seeing. You guys did an absolutely brilliant kind of, takedown of the arguments around e-fuel recently, which is because we've seen the European Union make some concessions on e-fuels that after 2035, no ICE cars will be able to be sold unless they can run on e-fuels.
Yeah.
But it's so expensive to produce in large quantities that surely keep the e-fuels for like the aviation industry and some battery electric technology for vehicles.
Yeah.
But there's a big lobby. Obviously.
Yes, no, very big lobby. And it is also that, it is that thing of I must admit, I hear it less now, is the, I don't want to wait 19 hours while I charge my car on the motorway. And you go, well, you won't, but it doesn't matter. Don't, keep your diesel. I can't help saying that. Just keep driving your diesel. No one cares. But that argument is diminishing. It is like the range anxiety is kind of the argument. It's nothing to do with reality. The argument of range anxiety has disappeared. It's now charger anxiety, which I think is far more legitimate reason to be worried about it. I've had range anxiety literally once the first time I drove an electric car, and never again. But boy, have I had charger anxiety and charger fury as well.
I can completely. And sometimes I was thinking, this is an emerging technology.
Yeah.
the infrastructure, unsurprisingly, as the technology emerges and gets adopted, and the infrastructure is never going to be perfect. It's going to take time to introduce.
Yeah.
But I mean, most of us, people are never obviously going to have had negative experiences. But what I think is quite telling is that because 17% of new cars sold in the UK are electric, more and more people know someone directly who have an electric car, and that's the really exciting thing. Because people's real life experiences of EV ownership are a lot more positive than some of the anecdotal stories told in the press. And so when people go, you see it quite a lot. People go, I've had an electric car. I can't even remember the last time I used a public charger.
Yeah.
And people go, what, really? You go, I never have to visit a charging station. Gone are the days of having to go and top up my car, queuing to get into a supermarket petrol station, because I just plug it in at home and go, and overnight.
I'm not using it.
That's going to be a key part of transition, is those kind of like experiences. Like in my group, our friend has just got himself a Tesla, and a lot of my more skeptical friends. So you can see them being a bit like, oh, is it okay? Is it? And maybe I'll get one. That's this word of mouth, I think, is going to be really important.
Yes.
But yeah, I completely understand people's charging anxieties. But again, I don't know.
Well, it will be. I mean, it is. The companies that can run an effective charging network that you can rely on, that isn't too expensive and isn't price gouging you. They're going to be busy. They're going to, because people are working. It doesn't take long. It's the same as with petrol. You drive along the motorway and you see how much petrol costs on a motorway filling station. So you go to the one around the corner from your house, which is cheaper.
Yeah.
And the result of that is the AA have to help about 2,500 people a week who've run out of petrol on a motorway because they don't want to buy the petrol there.
Yeah.
Which is the flip side of that.
And the car that's run out of fuel than an electric vehicle that's run out of.
Yeah.
I mean, I do wonder how Tesla do it. Tesla's superchargers quite a bit cheaper.
So annoying.
It'd be nice if it could be available. But if they've got a business model that works, you wonder why someone else can't come in and similar business model that's open up to all EVs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is again one of the biggest, when I look at all the different kind of clumps of kind of narrative challenges that exist around EVs, one of them is obviously fueling costs.
Yeah.
And people try and suggest that because electricity prices are at such unprecedented highs, therefore electric vehicles are no cheaper to run than a petrol price, which is nonsense. Even with electricity prices where they are, they're still much cheaper. The only times when they become more expensive is if you are getting all the charge for your vehicle from a motorway rapid charger.
Yeah.
But who does that? No one gets all the fuel for their car by filling up on the motorway because everyone knows how expensive it is. So it's just these really unrealistic scenarios are presented to suggest that the economics around EVs don't make sense. They just don't reflect real life driving behaviors. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, is try to speak to more EV drivers and, people like Fully Charged and EVA England, try to get the lived experiences of EV drivers out there more often, rather than just Charles Cohen in the Times saying, I had a bad experience with my car there. Everyone should ditch their EVs.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, the Rowan Atkinsons and Giles Corrins, I've now decided not, because I was going to do a sort of polite rebuttal. And I actually think, no, I don't, because that just gives them more. I don't.
Well, Carbon Brief did a very good one.
Oh, did they?
Yes, they did. They got published in The Guardian. They got a lot of views and seems to have been well received.
Oh, good.
We were involved in a little bit in kind of helping them.
Yes.
I think someone rebutted it, because otherwise it was just, it sounded, a lot of it, for someone who...
was very subtle and plausible. Yeah.
And you're quoting a study from Volvo from years ago that's being debunked repeatedly.
It's been so debunked endlessly, again and again and again.
So the most basic level of Google research found that article had been debunked.
Well, there were the two ones that were that was that one, and also the. I mean, it really is shameful. I'm not going to pull my punches on this, Mr. Atkinson. That he went on. I'm very anxious about rare earth metals in batteries, and you go, literally, you go Google. Are there rare earth metals in batteries? No. The answer just came, no. There never have been. They're not used in batteries. No battery has rare earth metals in it.
No.
And he's an electrical engineer by training. And I know nothing about it, but I understand that there are rare earth metals in electric motors. There are rare earth metals in your phone that makes it go zzz. That's what does that. But they're not in batteries, and they never have been.
No,
it's just it's lazy, sloppy, and it's been spoon-fed by the fossil fuel industry, that kind of misinformation, I'm afraid, Mr. Atkinson.
The mineral one is a whole other kind of ballgame. And look, yes, lots of minerals like lithium and cobalt, but decreasingly so, are used in battery manufacture. But what's the battery pack in a car? A few hundred kilos.
Yeah.
At the end of its average 14-year life, they can recycle so much of it that only 30 kilograms of those minerals is lost. In the meantime, a petrol equivalent car has burned through 17,000 liters of hydrocarbons extracted from the earth.
Yeah.
So, and I think that equates to a stack of oil drums 90 meters high.
Right.
So when we're concerned about the impacts of mineral extraction, the impact of an EV, 30 grams lost in total over its lifetime versus 90 meter high stack of oil drums shows how it's the debate has been massively skewed, that EVs are misrepresented as being more impactful on the environment than the cars they're replacing.
Yeah.
It's a bit.
And also I always want to point out to people who try and make those arguments, who does this benefit the most?
What?
It benefits the fossil fuel industry, who are, without question, the biggest and most powerful and wealthiest institutions the human race has ever created. So we've got a battle on our hands to counter their narrative. I mean, they've got plenty of money and time and energy, and they've got tens of thousands of willing, I'm going to call them patsies, maybe an offensive term, to do their arguing for them. People will repeat those myths and lies. And we don't call them lies, do you? What do you call them? Mistruths.
Non-factually based narrative.
Non-factually based opinions.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes, I shouldn't have said lie.
Then, but the as hard as vested interests might work to tackle this transition, it doesn't.
It's still happening.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And let's be honest, an awful lot of people who move to EVs, not everyone, but an awful lot are not necessarily doing it primarily because of environmental concerns.
No.
It's actually better that they're doing it because there's an economic rationale. Much as we are seeing lots of countries like India and China massively embrace renewable technologies, a lot of that is driven because, quite simply, the price per kilowatt hour or price per megawatt hour of generating electricity through renewable is just so much lower than using hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
That's when there's a business case, that's when things shift, right?
Yeah.
And there's a kind of insurmountable business case for making these transitions of these new technologies. And this comes to a point that kind of worries me about the UK a little bit, is the future of our car industry. It's not massive compared to other countries, but there's some still pretty significant numbers of cars made. I think 775,000 cars were made last year in the UK.
Yeah, which employs tens of thousands of people, jobs to.
I think indirectly, it's something that the figure that flies around is like 800,000.
Right. Wow.
And it generates well over £20 billion in export revenue every year, because 80% of the cars we produce go abroad. But most of those cars are going to markets that are introducing a zero-emission vehicle mandate.
Yes.
So,
hello.
Right. So we export most of our cars to the European Union, China, and America.
Yeah.
California and quite a few states in the US, for example, have introduced a ZEV mandate that will mean that by 2035, not a single petrol or diesel car can be sold. So the markets we sell to are moving away from the vehicles we produce.
Yeah.
So what do? Do we just sit there and carry on and hope for the best and then watch our car industry wither or die? Or do we actually invest and support our car industry to make that transition to produce the vehicles that our markets want?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting challenge.
I mean, we have to hope. That's a report that's literally come out today, is Lucid, the electric vehicle company in America, that have really only this year actually released a car. I mean, I saw a Lucid Air 10 years ago. And I just thought, this is one of those cars that's never, well, they actually are now making cars. But anyway, they have just signed a deal with Aston Martin to produce a luxury touring car with Aston Martin, an electric, 100% electric car. So, that's better than no news. And I mean, you could argue that Aston Martin is a fairly niche market.
But then you can argue that, but I guess a lot of the value of the cars we export come from those kind of quite niche, high-end new sports cars. It's interesting that Aston Martin are willing to make that transition when you've got someone like McLaren that seems to claim that all people who buy McLarens want the noise of a petrol engine. Yeah,
they probably do. But I mean, it's in a sense, I think it's kind of, whatever. I'm not interested because it's such a tiny, minuscule market of obsessives. It's kind of, from a global point of view, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if someone drives if in 100 years' time, someone's driving a McLaren that makes a lot of noise and burns some specially bought cans of fossil fuel from a specialist dealership, which is probably what it'll be. Who cares? It's not, it's like, it's just noisy and the guy's a pillock.
You wonder though, someone who can afford a McLaren, if they're suddenly doing a test lap around Silverstone and they get absolutely shredded by an electric car, I wonder when suddenly they're like, oh, I might trade this in for one of them.
I don't think it. I mean, I think it's fine because I love. I grew up with it, and I grew up with a brother who was an engineer that made Formula One. He worked in Formula One engineering quite a lot, and made cars and did all sorts of weird conversions and put big. And it was brilliant. It's lovely. But even then, back then, that was such a microscopically small part of the whole industry. Because basically what we need to do, back then, or what we need to do now, is not produce 10 million diesel cars a year. We need to not produce any. And that's where the big impact is. And diesel trucks and diesel buses and diesel vans, we've been living with those for the last 50 years. That's what we need to get rid of.
And our ability to produce in this UK, I guess, is dependent on us building supply chains like Gigafactory.
Yeah.
And I know everyone's still waiting for this decision about a battery factory for JLR in the UK that was meant to be getting announced a few weeks ago, but we're still waiting to hear.
Yes. No, not heard a thing. Yeah. No, I mean, it is a big problem. I mean, is that something do you think you would, because I think the Chinese cars, I mean, we can't really announce it yet, but we got some amazing news about Chinese cars that are going to appear in our live shows. And it's such a shift because of we've sort of seen this pattern happen before. Nothing to do with electric cars, but in the past when people made fun of Japanese cars and they were really rubbish, and who's going to buy that? And they're not as good as our massive, particularly in America, that's where that impact was huge. And then somebody bought a little Nissan or a little Toyota or a little Honda, and they worked out these are actually quite good. And then they just wiped the floor. They
look at what it did to the UK. Like people were used to buying British cars that could barely make it 1,000 miles without the gearbox falling out.
Yeah.
And then suddenly these like Nissan Cherries started turning up.
Yeah, just were really reliable.
And then suddenly out of nowhere, Toyota's the biggest car company in the world.
Yeah.
Well, the flip side is you guys have discussed is what's going to happen to the big established car makers like Toyota, who've kind of like held off making the transition to pure EVs for so long that they're now desperately playing catch up. And you hear an awful lot of people predicting that in 10 years' time they could cease to be as a company.
Yeah.
And the biggest car company in the world is likely to be a Chinese brand we've never heard of.
Yes.
And a lot of people drawing those parallels between what happened to Japanese domination of like consumer electronics industry.
Yeah.
We could be seeing a repeat of that with Japanese kind of not domination, but huge presence in the car industry.
Yeah.
And that thing. So it does. It is a huge challenge to a lot of the kind of established brands. Can they catch up and keep up with where the Chinese are going?
Yeah.
And perhaps the fight will be for getting more Chinese manufacturing presence in European countries, for example. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I like to think that the Chinese surge and drive forward and the stuff they're producing will act as a bit of a rocket up the backsides of a lot of the established car industry to make that transition themselves.
Yes. And then I'd like to wind up with just the thing we have touched on before, the in the UK, the 2030 ban on the sale of new combustion vehicles. Because I think that is partly what we're seeing, this increased sort of waves of negativity in the press. So I have a press watching, I don't even an app that shows me stories, and one of the subsections is electric vehicles, but it takes it from the tabloid press. So every day there's maybe 5 or 6. They always personalized to I tried an electric car and it didn't go well. We drove these 3 electric cars and used the charging network and it was a disaster. Really constant, that drumbeat of constant negativity. And then they're not up to the job, and what about the batteries and all those? We know all the arguments.
Well,
and I went, why is this happening now? That wasn't happening 2 years ago. No, they was completely ignorant of electric cars. They might say, something about Elon Musk and Tesla or something, but it wasn't. But this, I'm wondering whether that is inspired by the fact that 2030 isn't slightly less further away than it was.
You've seen. There's quite a significant comment piece in the Times a few weeks ago that really kind of, we've been waiting for it, but really kind of seems to formalize the Times position in terms of wanting to see the 2030 phase out date pushed back.
Right.
I think there's a couple of things here. Firstly, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about the dates, because people will still be able to buy cars in 2030 that have diesel and petrol that go into them,
Right.
and carry on buying hybrids until 2035. So it's actually 12 years away until you can no longer buy new cars that no longer fueled by petrol and diesel.
But who buys new? You can buy a secondhand. You'll be able to buy a secondhand diesel car in 2040.
Yeah, so it's being misrepresented. It's a lot of confusion is being so people are being told it's 2030 that petrol and diesel cars will be phased out. It's actually really 2035. And words are being used to imply new is often dropped. So people, there will be a ban. So some people come away thinking in 2035, is someone going to come to my house and take?
Can't drive my van. Yeah,
not at all. Even under these. The SMMT, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, their own projections suggest that by 2035, half of the vehicles on our road will still be ICE internal combustion vehicles, and will continue to be so for a while. They'll just, as they come to the end of their lives and scrapped, they'll need to be replaced with battery electric vehicles.
Yeah,
but I think you're going to see a big push around this probably because the UK government's actually doing something quite good, which is the introduction of a zero emission vehicle mandate. So that's basically the regulatory framework by how we will get to these phase-out dates. So what it essentially is an introduction of a series of targets that the car industry has to meet for the minimum proportion of EVs that it sells each year. And as each year passes, that percentage goes up. So when this gets introduced in 2024, 22% of the cars that a car manufacturer sells in the UK will have to be zero emission electric.
Right.
And that will go up and up and up until we get to 100% in 2035. So the government did its final consultation on this, and it's next month announcing its response to the final consultation response it got. And then it should be going into Parliament to be enacted for introduction in 2024. So I don't think it's entirely by chance that an increase in these kind of like this questioning of whether we can achieve a 2030 phase-out date beginning to come up, because I think it's a tactic to try to undermine that mandate. So I think that's what's happening. And you'll see people using, for example, the inadequacy of our charging infrastructure as they're saying, we're not going to be ready for this. And you're like, still 7 years away.
Yeah.
Charging industry has committed £6 billion. We've got 60,000 chargers already. It's been concluded that means we're on track because of this exponential rise you'll see in infrastructure rollouts to hit 300,000 chargers in 2030. Pretty confident we're going to do it. But it's definitely those anecdotal stories of someone having a bad experience of charging it are being used to suggest that everybody's experience of charging infrastructure rubbish. Therefore, we're not ready for these phase-out dates. So that's a fun one to work with.
Yeah, it is. That's going to be, that will be very interesting to see when that happens and how that pans out. What we'll have to do is, now we've had a successful experience of recording a podcast. He said, keeping his fingers crossed, because we haven't quite finished yet. But we'll have to come back and see what happened with that legislation. You know, that would be.
It'll be really good to keep people up to date on that. Once we know the dates for when the government's going to announce its final response to the consultation, we don't know exactly when it's going to go into Parliament. But once we know, we'll let you know. Because we might want to touch on it. Because it sounds really techie, but it is, of all the different things the government is trying to do to achieve its net zero targets, the single biggest thing in terms of its impact on reducing carbon dioxide emissions is the ZEV mandate. It's reducing the carbon impact of the cars that we drive. It's massive. It really doesn't get much coverage because it sounds
a bit nerdy and a bit sciencey. I mean, I'm allowed to be a bit more political than you in that I haven't got a huge amount of sympathy or support for our current administration. I can say that. I think we've had some dodgy
podcasts, definitely.
Yeah. But I can say that. But that said, there's two bits of sort of government, decision making and legislation that our current administration have pushed forward and stuck with. One is electric vehicles, and the other is offshore wind.
Yeah.
So there's loads of things I could be critical about them, and they're all boring. But those two have made a remarkable impact on our world. And yesterday was a good example of that because it was sunny and windy in the UK, and the wholesale electricity price for 4 hours was under a penny a kilowatt hour, the wholesale price. So we were all paying way more than that. Yeah. And if you had a variable tariff, that's the time to charge a car and fill your batteries and heat your water and do your cooking. I mean, that is amazing. And it didn't quite go negative, but it was a long period of time. And that's because there was a lot of wind and a lot of solar.
Well, I love geeking out and going onto those websites to show you current UK electricity generation. Yeah. And you see 80% is coming from non-fossil fuel certs.
Yes, it is extraordinary.
And that's such a huge change over such a short period of time. Our global leadership of offshore wind is impressive, and
incredible.
China's introducing huge amounts, but so you would expect of a country as large with such a large economy. But this, I think, the UK has really driven that forward, and it helps ensure that a lot of the electricity we're putting into our EVs is
cleaner,
clean.
Yeah,
and there's element, and I think the UK is now. I think we sold 270,000 electric vehicles in the UK last year, which means we're the fourth largest EV market in the world.
Yeah, which is crazy.
And when we don't have that big a population.
No.
So EV uptake is good. And a lot of that EV uptake has happened since the government removed its kind of financial incentives.
Yeah.
Which that's what you want. You really want this thing to be happening without government.
Without any incentives or subsidies. Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, so that's encouraging. I can understand why there's probably being a slight tailing off because of the cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
And, high electricity prices, and the perception is this the right time to do it. But, all the projections from people like Cornwall Insight are that wholesale electricity prices are going to decline quite significantly in the years ahead. So EVs are cheaper to run now. And the gap between them and petrol cars is going to get bigger and bigger in 24, 25, 26, which is really encouraging.
I mean, this is one thing I've noticed on the app that I don't obsessively look at, but I do check regularly, which is just tells you the wholesale electricity price, and that used to be constantly up in the high 30s. When they've checked like late last year, and which I'd never seen before, and now it's at the most it's about 28 pence a kilowatt hour.
It's coming down.
So it's definitely coming down. Yeah.
A whole other podcast on this, so I'm not going to just go into it, but the frustrating thing is electricity and solar is such a cheaper way of generating electricity than gas.
Yeah.
But our market is so, the price you pay for electricity is determined by the price.
It's determined by gas, by the most expensive thing.
So, I mean, renewable energy companies having a whale of a time.
Oh, God, yeah, they're raking it in.
Money.
Yeah.
But doesn't cost them anywhere near what it costs gas companies generally.
Yeah.
So there is this whole push about how do we decouple the electricity markets to ensure actually paying for the cost it was to produce this electricity. But we can only speak to one of my other colleagues who know a lot more about that.
Yes, no, it is that because it's so complicated. My brain melts very rapidly.
It sounded simple, and then someone tried to explain it to me. I went, just stop.
Yeah, just stop now. I need a cup of tea and a lie down in a dark room. But anyway, Colin, thank you so much for rejoining, and we finally got there, which is really good, and it's really good talking to you. And we definitely will talk to you again. It's been a real joy. Well, thanks very much indeed. Really hope you enjoyed that. Please do subscribe if for no other reason that you'll hear what's coming next week. There's always brilliant people. We've got some amazing people that we've been recording podcasts with, way above. We're punching above our weight. Is that the thing? I think that's the phrase. We're getting amazing people on this show. Really, really interesting. So do stay tuned, and we'll see you next week. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.